When did the golden child lose everything at last? For most of my life, I honestly believed my brother Kyle could do absolutely anything and still somehow come out looking innocent in our parents' eyes. He could make terrible decisions, lie, fail, break things, hurt people, and walk away with sympathy. Meanwhile, I could do something completely normal, or even something good, and somehow it would still be treated like a problem. That was the dynamic in our family for as long as I can remember. Kyle was the golden child. I was the one who was never quite enough. If Kyle skipped family dinner to go hang out with his friends, my mom would smile and say, "Oh, Kyle needs his social time." She would act like it was healthy and charming and proof that he was outgoing. But if I had drama club and missed dinner, suddenly I was selfish. Suddenly I was missing precious family moments. Suddenly I needed to remember what really mattered. Kyle got caught cheating on 3 different tests in high school, and my dad actually called the principal to explain that Kyle was just under a lot of pressure because he was so talented and overwhelmed. But when I got a B+ in chemistry, they hired me a tutor because clearly I was struggling and needed intervention. The double standard was insane. When Kyle was 19, he wrecked his car while drunk driving. Our parents covered it up, smoothed it over, and bought him a brand new truck because, according to them, he had learned his lesson and needed reliable transportation. When I accidentally scraped the garage door, they made me pay for the repairs out of the money from my part-time job because, apparently, responsibility built character. Kyle dropped out of college after 2 semesters, and they said he was finding himself. He was exploring his options. He was figuring out his path. I graduated with honors, and they said, well, anyone can get good grades if they have no social life and just study all the time. When Kyle decided he wanted to be a musician, even though he never practiced and never actually wrote any songs, my parents converted the garage into a recording studio for him. When I asked them for help with my student loans, they told me, "We need to be smart with money, and you need to learn independence." Kyle stole money from my mom's purse, and when she noticed cash missing, she convinced herself she must have spent it and forgotten. When her jewelry disappeared, she assumed she had misplaced it. When my dad's tools vanished from the garage, he figured he must have loaned them to someone. I tried pointing out the obvious pattern more than once, but every time I did, they acted like I was jealous. They said I was trying to cause drama. They made me feel like noticing reality was some kind of character flaw. Kyle once started a business with $20,000 of their retirement money. It failed in 3 months. Their response was, "At least he tried. Failure is the best teacher." When I asked for $1,000 to take a professional certification course, they said, "Maybe next year, when finances are better." I learned early that Kyle's mistakes were always opportunities for growth, while my needs were always inconveniences. But the breaking point did not come from any of that. The breaking point came when Grandma Dorothy got sick. Grandma needed full-time care, and she had about $200,000 saved. She had always planned to leave it equally to all the grandkids. It was not a massive fortune, but it was her life savings. It was what she had built from years of being careful, frugal, and generous. Suddenly, Kyle became the devoted grandson. Out of nowhere, he started visiting Grandma every day. He volunteered to manage her finances because, as he put it, everyone else was so busy. My parents praised him endlessly for stepping up. They said he was being mature, caring, and responsible. They acted like this was proof that Kyle had finally become the man they always believed he could be. Within 3 months, Grandma's savings started mysteriously draining away. Kyle claimed it was all going toward medical expenses and household needs, but he never had receipts. He would buy her generic groceries and pocket the rest, then claim he had bought organic everything. He convinced Grandma to sign power of attorney because, according to him, it was too stressful for her to deal with bills and banking. My parents refused to question anything. They said Kyle was being such a wonderful grandson, and how dare anyone suggest otherwise. Grandma passed away 6 months later. When the will was read, there was almost nothing left. Kyle had drained everything except about $10,000. The lawyer mentioned there were suspicious transfers, but because Kyle had power of attorney, technically it was complicated. Technically, he had legal access. My parents still defended him. They said he must have used the money for Grandma's care. They said we should be grateful that he had been there for her. That was when my cousin Ella, who worked at the bank, pulled me aside. She told me she was not supposed to say anything, but she had seen where the money actually went. Kyle had been transferring Grandma's money into his own accounts and then moving it almost immediately to a casino app. $200,000. Gambled away in 6 months. Grandma had been eating generic bread and watching her shows in a freezing house because Kyle told her the heating bill was too expensive, while he was gambling away her life savings online. Ella had screenshots of everything. The transfers from Grandma's account to Kyle's personal account, the immediate transfers from Kyle's account to the gambling site, the dates, the times, the amounts, everything matched exactly. She had been documenting it for months, but she had not known what to do because, on paper, Kyle had legal authority through the power of attorney. I called a family meeting. I told everyone I had something important to share about Grandma's estate. Kyle got defensive before I even started. He said that if this was about money, then I was being disgusting and disrespecting Grandma's memory. My parents started scolding me before I had even spoken, but I pulled out the printed screenshots and started passing them around. I said, here is $50,000 transferred to Kyle's personal account on January 10th. Here is the same $50,000 transferred to Bet King Casino 3 hours later. Here is another $30,000 on January 25th, another $40,000 on February 3rd. Every single transfer is documented. Kyle tried to grab the papers. He said those were private banking records, but everyone had already seen them. My Uncle Robert, who was a cop, looked at Kyle and asked if he wanted to explain why Grandma's money was going to online gambling while she was dying. Kyle actually said Grandma wanted him to invest the money for the family's future, and gambling was just his investment strategy. The room exploded. Uncle Robert shot up out of his chair and crossed the living room in about 3 steps. He got right in Kyle's face with that cop posture he had, the kind that made people confess to things they had not even done. Kyle stumbled backward toward the hallway, holding his hands up like Robert was about to hit him. My mom started screaming at Robert to calm down and stop attacking her son. My dad joined in, yelling that this was completely inappropriate and that Robert needed to back off right now. Robert did not move an inch. He just kept staring at Kyle with that interrogation room look and asked if Kyle had seriously just called stealing $200,000 from his dying grandmother an investment strategy. Kyle's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. I could see sweat forming on his forehead, even though the house was cold. Mom pushed herself between them. She actually put her hands on Robert's chest and shoved him, telling him he was being aggressive and threatening and that she would not allow that kind of behavior in her home. I stayed in my chair, still holding one of the bank statements, watching everything happen like I was watching a movie. Aunt Linda was crying into her hands near the fireplace. Other relatives were talking over each other. Some were asking Kyle questions. Some were defending him. Some were just making shocked noises because nobody knew what to do with what we had just heard. My parents literally positioned themselves on either side of Kyle like bodyguards. Mom stood on his left. Dad stood on his right. They formed a human wall between Kyle and everyone else in the room. Uncle Robert took one step back, but he kept his eyes locked on Kyle. Every muscle in his jaw was working. Kyle looked around the room like he was searching for an escape route. His eyes jumped from person to person, and then he made his move. He bolted for the front door, shoving past Mom so hard she stumbled into the coffee table. Uncle Robert was faster. Maybe it was all the police training, because he cut Kyle off before Kyle even got halfway across the living room. Robert planted himself directly in front of the door, crossed his arms, and told Kyle he was not leaving the house until he explained where Grandma's money actually went. Kyle tried to go around him. Robert sidestepped and blocked him again. That was when my dad did something I had never seen him do in 30 years. He pushed Uncle Robert, both hands on Robert's chest, shoving him away from the door, yelling at him to get out of Kyle's way. Robert barely moved. He just looked at my dad like he could not believe what had just happened. For 1 second, I thought they were actually going to fight right there in the living room. The whole room went quiet, except for Aunt Linda crying. Then Ella spoke up in her quiet bank voice, the calm voice she used when she was explaining why someone's check had bounced. She said she had been watching these transfers for months and had documentation of every single transaction. Her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. She explained that Kyle had not just transferred money once or twice. He had been moving funds almost every day toward the end, sometimes 3 or 4 times in a single day when he was losing. She had dates, times, amounts, and transaction records. My mom spun around to face Ella, and I watched her expression change from protective mother to attack mode in about 2 seconds. She pointed her finger at Ella and accused her of violating banking privacy laws and betraying family trust. Her voice got higher and louder with every word. She said Ella had no right to spy on Kyle's transactions, and that Ella could lose her job for sharing confidential banking information. Ella did not flinch. She stood there with her arms at her sides and explained, in that same calm voice, that elder financial abuse is a mandatory reporting situation. She said when bank employees see suspicious patterns of an elderly person's money being drained by someone with power of attorney, they are actually required by law to document it and report suspected exploitation. Then she looked right at my mom and said she had been following the legal requirements of her job, nothing more. Uncle Robert pulled his phone out of his pocket and announced he was calling his detective friend, who handled financial crimes against elderly victims. My dad lunged for the phone. He actually tried to grab it out of Robert's hand, yelling that this was a private family matter and that we did not need police involved. Robert held the phone up high over his head like they were children fighting over a toy, and Dad grabbed his arm, trying to pull it down. They were chest to chest, red-faced, both breathing hard. I thought punches were about to happen. Aunt Linda rushed over and wedged herself between them. She pushed them apart with her hands on both their chests, begging them to stop. She was crying harder now, mascara running down her face, saying this was not helping anything. That was when Kyle dropped to his knees in the middle of the living room. He put his hands over his face, and his shoulders started shaking. He began sobbing, big, gulping sobs that sounded fake, even though I think some part of them was real. Between the sobs, he admitted he had a gambling problem. He said he never meant for it to get this bad. He said he thought he could control it. He said he was going to pay Grandma back when he finally hit it big. He looked up at everyone with tears and snot running down his face and said he had been so close to a major jackpot. He said one major win would have fixed everything. He just needed one more big win. My parents transformed instantly. It was like someone flipped a switch. Mom dropped to her knees beside Kyle and wrapped her arms around him, rocking him like he was 5 years old. She kept saying, "It's okay, baby. You're sick. You need help, not judgment. We're going to get you through this." Dad crouched down too and put his hand on Kyle's back. Then Dad stood up and addressed the room like he was giving a speech. He announced that Kyle had admitted he had a disease. He said gambling addiction is a recognized mental illness, and we all needed to focus on getting Kyle treatment instead of assigning blame and punishment. He said anyone who really loved Kyle would support him through recovery instead of attacking him when he was at his lowest point. That was when I finally stood up. The bank statement was still clutched in my hand. I looked around at all those relatives. Some were nodding along with my dad. Some looked deeply uncomfortable. Some were still crying. I asked if anyone remembered that Grandma had lived in a cold house eating cheap food while Kyle gambled away her life savings. I said it slowly and clearly so everyone could hear me. Several relatives nodded, including Uncle Robert and Ella. One cousin said Grandma had complained about being cold the previous winter. But my parents acted like I had said the cruelest, most heartless thing imaginable. Mom looked at me with pure disgust and said I was being unsympathetic to Kyle's mental health struggles. Dad said I was choosing to judge and punish instead of showing compassion for someone suffering from a disease. Uncle Robert made the call anyway. He turned away from my dad and walked toward the kitchen with the phone to his ear. I could hear him talking to someone in his cop voice, all business and facts. He mentioned power of attorney abuse, elder financial exploitation, documented transfers to gambling sites, $200,000 over 6 months, a family member who worked at the bank and had complete documentation of every transaction. My dad followed him to the kitchen doorway, still protesting. He said Robert was making a terrible mistake. He said this would destroy the family. Mom stayed on the floor with Kyle, holding him while he cried into her shoulder. And I stood there with the bank statements in my hand, wondering how we had reached a point where showing evidence of theft was somehow the cruel thing to do. Then the front door opened. Brittany walked in carrying 2 grocery bags, calling out that she had brought the snacks Mom asked for. She stopped in the entryway. Her mouth fell open as she took in the scene. Kyle was still on the floor with Mom wrapped around him while he sobbed into her shoulder. Dad was standing near them with his arms crossed, looking ready to fight anyone who came close. Uncle Robert was coming back from the kitchen, with his phone still in his hand. Aunt Linda was crying quietly in the corner chair. Ella stood near me, holding more bank statements. 3 other relatives were scattered around the living room, looking like they wanted to disappear into the furniture. Brittany slowly set the grocery bags down. She asked what was going on and why everyone was crying. Kyle lifted his head and tried to say something, but only made a choking sound before burying his face back into Mom's shoulder. Dad stepped forward and told Brittany this was a private family matter and maybe she should leave. Ella walked over to Brittany and said she needed to see something important. She held out the bank statements and started explaining in that calm, quiet voice that Kyle had power of attorney for Grandma and had transferred $200,000 from Grandma's accounts to gambling sites over 6 months while Grandma was dying. Brittany took the papers. Her hands started shaking as she looked through them. Her face went completely white. She asked if it was real. Ella nodded and showed her the transfer dates and amounts. $50,000 on January 10th to Kyle's account, then to Bet King Casino 3 hours later, $30,000 on January 25th, $40,000 on February 3rd. Every single transfer documented with dates and times. Brittany looked at Kyle and asked if it was true. She asked if he had really stolen from his dying grandmother to gamble. Kyle finally managed to speak. He said it was not like that. He said he had a gambling problem. He said it was a disease and he could not control it. Brittany cut him off. She asked how long he had been lying to her. Her voice got louder. She said she had loaned him $5,000 the previous month because he claimed it was for a business investment. She asked if that had been gambling money too. Kyle did not answer. Mom jumped in and said this was not the time to attack Kyle when he was clearly suffering and needed support. Dad moved beside Mom and said everyone who really loved Kyle should focus on solutions and getting him help instead of blame and punishment. Mom looked at Brittany and said if she cared about Kyle at all, she would stand by him during his recovery from this terrible disease. Then Uncle Robert walked back into the living room and announced that Detective Sarah Moore was coming over to take statements and review all the evidence. He said that while the power of attorney made prosecution complicated, the documented pattern of transfers to gambling sites during Grandma's final illness created a strong case for elder financial exploitation. Dad's face turned red. He pointed at the door and told Robert to get out of his house right now. He said Robert had no right to bring police into a private family matter. Robert did not move. He said Grandma was his sister, and he was not going to let her death and the theft of her life savings get swept under the rug to protect Kyle. Dad took a step toward Robert with his fists clenched. Aunt Linda stood up and positioned herself between them. The living room split down the middle, like someone had drawn a line on the floor. Uncle Robert stayed near the kitchen doorway. Aunt Linda moved to stand next to him. Ella walked to their side, still holding the bank statements. Brittany looked at Kyle one more time, then crossed the room to stand with Ella. I was already on that side. We all stood facing my parents, who had literally positioned themselves in front of Kyle like bodyguards. A few other relatives looked at each other nervously and stayed in their seats, unsure where to stand or what to do. My cousin from Ohio moved closer to the door like she was planning an escape route. Mom kept her arms around Kyle and glared at us like we were attacking her child. Dad stood with his shoulders back and his jaw set in that way that meant he was done listening to anyone. Then the doorbell rang. Everyone froze. Dad said nobody was answering that door. Uncle Robert said that was probably Detective Moore, and refusing to let her in would not help Kyle's situation. Dad walked to the front door and stood in front of it with his arms crossed. The doorbell rang again. A woman's voice called through the door, saying she was Detective Moore and that she was there to take statements about a financial exploitation case. Dad yelled through the door that this was a private residence and that she needed a warrant. Detective Moore responded calmly that she could take statements at the police station instead if he preferred, and that making this difficult would not help his son. She said she had documentation of suspicious transfers from an elderly woman's accounts and was investigating potential exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Dad stood there for another minute. Then he finally unlocked the door, but he blocked the entrance with his body. He said he was only letting her in because he insisted on being present for any conversation with Kyle. Detective Moore nodded and said that was fine. Then she stepped inside. She looked about 40, with short brown hair, plain clothes, and a badge clipped to her belt. She looked around the room, taking in the crying relatives and the clear division of the family into two groups. She introduced herself and asked where she could set up to review the documentation. Dad pointed to the dining room table and said she could use that, but he was staying right there the whole time. Detective Moore agreed and walked to the dining room. She pulled out a notebook and her phone. She asked Ella to start by walking her through the banking documentation. Ella sat across from her and laid out the bank statements in order. She explained the timeline of transfers, beginning in January. $50,000 transferred from Grandma's account to Kyle's personal account on January 10th. The same $50,000 transferred to Bet King Casino 3 hours later. Another $30,000 on January 25th, $40,000 on February 3rd, $25,000 on February 18th. She went through every single transaction with dates and amounts. Detective Moore took notes and photographed each document with her phone. Then she asked Ella to explain the connection between the transfer dates and Grandma's medical appointments. Ella pulled out a calendar she had made. It showed that Kyle transferred money on the same days he was supposedly taking Grandma to doctor visits or picking up medications. Detective Moore photographed the calendar too. Then she asked about Grandma's living conditions during that time. Ella explained that Grandma had complained about being cold because Kyle said the heating bill was too expensive. She ate generic food because Kyle said organic food was too costly. She wore the same clothes for months because Kyle said new ones were not in the budget, all while he was transferring thousands of dollars every week to gambling sites. Detective Moore turned to Kyle and asked him to explain the transfers from his grandmother's account to his personal account and then to the gambling sites. Kyle sat up straighter and wiped his eyes. Then he said Grandma knew exactly what he was doing with the money and approved of his investment strategy. He claimed she understood that he was trying to grow her savings, so there would be more for everyone after she passed. Detective Moore asked if he had any written documentation of his grandmother approving these transfers. Kyle shook his head and said it was all verbal agreements between him and Grandma during private conversations. He said she trusted him completely and did not need everything in writing because they had a special relationship. My dad nodded along like that made perfect sense. My mom squeezed Kyle's shoulder supportively. I could not stay quiet anymore. I interrupted and pointed out that Grandma had early dementia during her final 6 months, and that it was documented in her medical records from the neurologist. Detective Moore looked at me and asked if I had copies of those medical records. I said I could get them from the doctor's office. Uncle Robert added that this was exactly why Kyle had pushed so hard for power of attorney in the first place. Kyle had told the whole family that Grandma was getting forgetful and needed someone responsible to handle her bills and banking. Kyle's face went red. He said that was not fair. He said he got power of attorney because Grandma asked him to help her because she was stressed about managing everything. Detective Moore made notes. Then she asked Kyle directly if he transferred approximately $200,000 from his grandmother's accounts to online gambling sites between January and June. Kyle looked at my dad. My dad was already pulling out his phone. Kyle said he wanted to consult an attorney before answering any more questions and that he did not feel comfortable continuing the conversation without legal representation. My parents immediately started calling their lawyer friend, the one who handled real estate closings. Mom kept saying they needed him to come over right away because Kyle was being interrogated without proper legal counsel. Detective Moore calmly said Kyle had every right to speak with an attorney and that she respected that decision. She explained that the documented evidence spoke for itself, regardless of whether Kyle gave any additional statements. She said the banking records and transaction history created a clear timeline of financial exploitation. Dad kept trying to reach the lawyer while Mom hovered over Kyle, telling him not to say another word until they had proper representation. Detective Moore gathered her notes and photographs and said she had enough documentation to move forward with the investigation. She handed me her card and told me to contact her if I obtained Grandma's medical records or any other relevant documents. Uncle Robert walked her to the door and thanked her for coming so quickly. After she left, my parents started yelling at me and Uncle Robert for bringing police into a private family matter and making Kyle look like a criminal. The next week was a mess of phone calls and secret conversations. Uncle Robert coordinated with relatives who wanted answers about what had happened to Grandma's money. He called everyone in the family individually and asked what Kyle had told them about Grandma's expenses and medical care. That was when we discovered Kyle had told different family members completely different stories, and none of the numbers added up. He told one aunt that Grandma needed special medication costing $3,000 a month. He told another uncle that Grandma's house needed major repairs, including a new roof and foundation work. He told one cousin that Grandma wanted to prepay her funeral expenses and buy a premium burial plot. Every story was different. When we added up all the amounts Kyle claimed he had spent, the total was more than the $200,000 that had actually disappeared. Aunt Linda took charge of tracking down Grandma's real medical bills and household expenses from the last 6 months of her life. She called every doctor's office, pharmacy, and service provider Grandma used. She got copies of bills for medical appointments, prescriptions, home health aides, utilities, and groceries. Then she made a spreadsheet with every verified expense. The total came to maybe $30,000 for everything. That meant Kyle had gambled away at least $170,000 that had absolutely nothing to do with Grandma's care. When Aunt Linda showed me the spreadsheet, I felt sick. Seeing how little Kyle had actually spent on Grandma compared with what he stole was worse than I expected. Ella went to her bank manager and explained the whole situation. She asked for permission to provide official statements about the suspicious transaction patterns she had observed. The bank manager reviewed Ella's documentation and admitted the bank should have flagged the activity sooner, but because the power of attorney paperwork appeared legitimate, the system had not caught it as potential exploitation. He agreed to let Ella provide official statements and said the bank would cooperate with any investigation. Ella was relieved because she could finally speak openly without worrying that she was violating privacy rules. I scheduled a meeting with a civil attorney named Mr. Harrison, who specialized in estate litigation and elder abuse cases. His office was downtown, in a building that smelled like old books and coffee. Mr. Harrison was about 60. With gray hair and reading glasses, he kept pushing up his nose. I brought everything: the bank statements, Ella's timeline, Aunt Linda's expense spreadsheet, copies of the power of attorney paperwork. Mr. Harrison spent almost an hour reviewing everything and asking detailed questions about Kyle's relationship with Grandma and the timeline of events. He explained that criminal prosecution was complicated because the power of attorney technically gave Kyle legal authority to access Grandma's accounts, but a civil action for breach of fiduciary duty had a much better chance of success. He said that having power of attorney creates a legal responsibility to act in the person's best interest. Using that person's money for personal benefit, especially for gambling, clearly violates that responsibility. After reviewing the documents again, Mr. Harrison said we had a strong case that Kyle had violated his fiduciary responsibility by using Grandma's money for himself instead of for her care. He explained the process for filing a civil lawsuit and what we might potentially recover. Then he gave me the hard news about costs. He estimated legal fees around $15,000, with no guarantee of recovering anything if Kyle had no assets. He said that even if we won and got a judgment, collecting money from someone who was broke and had gambling debts would be extremely difficult. I asked if it was worth pursuing. Mr. Harrison said that depended on whether we wanted justice and accountability or just the money back. Sometimes, he said, getting a legal judgment on record matters, even if you never collect a dollar. I told him I needed to talk to Uncle Robert about splitting the cost. When I explained everything to Uncle Robert, he said he was in for half the attorney fees. He said this was not about the money anymore. It was about making sure Kyle faced real consequences for once in his life. We both knew my parents would not contribute a dollar toward a lawsuit against their golden child. I called Mr. Harrison back and said we wanted to move forward with the civil case. He said he would start preparing the paperwork and that we would each need to pay a retainer of $7,500 to begin. That same afternoon, my mom called me crying and begged me not to pursue legal action against Kyle. She said the family was already torn apart and that a lawsuit would destroy any chance of healing and moving forward together. I told her Kyle had destroyed the family when he stole from Grandma and let her live in terrible conditions while he gambled away her life savings. Mom said I was being cruel and vindictive. She said I would regret this decision when it was too late to fix our relationship. Then Dad sent an email to me and Uncle Robert. He said that if we pursued legal action against Kyle, they would consider it harassment and would consult their own attorney about filing a countersuit. He said they had documentation of all the ways they had supported us over the years, and that we were showing incredible ingratitude by attacking their son during his time of need. That email made me realize the family division was not temporary. It was not fixable. It was permanent, and it was getting worse. Uncle Robert forwarded Dad's email to Mr. Harrison and asked if the threat of a countersuit was anything to worry about. Mr. Harrison said it was an empty threat meant to intimidate us. He said we had every legal right to pursue civil action for breach of fiduciary duty. He also told us to document all communication from my parents in case their harassment escalated. I sent Mr. Harrison my half of the retainer. Uncle Robert sent his portion the same day. Within 3 days of us filing the retainer, Kyle hired his own attorney named Richard Crane, who specialized in criminal defense. Uncle Robert heard about it through his police contacts before my parents even told anyone. Richard Crane immediately started making statements to Detective Moore about Kyle's gambling addiction being a recognized mental illness that impaired his judgment and decision-making. He was building a defense around diminished capacity, claiming Kyle could not form criminal intent because his addiction had controlled his actions. Detective Moore called to warn me this was a common strategy in financial exploitation cases. She said it sometimes worked to reduce charges or avoid prosecution entirely. She said the key would be proving Kyle knew what he was doing was wrong and did it anyway, and that the pattern of lies and cover-ups would help establish that. My parents jumped on that narrative like it was a life raft. Within a week, they were telling anyone who would listen that Kyle was a victim of disease who needed treatment and compassion, not punishment. Mom actually posted on Facebook about the importance of supporting family members struggling with addiction and how society needed to view addiction as a medical condition instead of a moral failing. She did not mention Kyle by name, but everyone knew what she meant. Several relatives who did not know the full story about Grandma's money commented with supportive messages. They told Mom she was brave for speaking out. They said they were proud of her for standing by her son. Every time I saw another comment praising my parents for their compassion and understanding, I wanted to scream. Meanwhile, I spent an entire weekend creating a detailed timeline document showing Kyle's pattern of manipulation and lies going back years. I started with the cheating incidents in high school, when Dad called the principal to make excuses for him. Then I included the drunk driving accident they covered up and the new truck they bought him afterward. I documented the failed business that lost $20,000 of their retirement money. Every time he stole from Mom's purse. Every time Dad's tools went missing. The recording studio they built that Kyle never used. I wrote down every double standard. Every excuse they made, every consequence I faced for minor mistakes while Kyle got away with major ones. The document ended up being 12 pages long, with dates and specific incidents. I sent copies to Uncle Robert, Ella, and Mr. Harrison. Ella added her own observations about Kyle's behavior at family gatherings over the previous 5 years. She remembered him borrowing $200 from Aunt Linda for car repairs that never happened. She had seen him ask Uncle Robert's son for $500 for a business opportunity that never materialized. She remembered one Christmas 3 years earlier when Kyle borrowed $300 from our cousin Michelle to help with rent and never paid it back. We started comparing notes and realized Kyle had been running small-scale scams on the family for years. Always different stories. Always urgent. Always promising to pay people back. Never following through. Uncle Robert took it upon himself to interview other relatives privately about their interactions with Kyle. He approached it like a detective investigation, asking specific questions about money Kyle had borrowed or business deals Kyle had proposed. What he discovered shocked even me. Kyle had borrowed money from at least 8 different family members over the previous 3 years, with amounts ranging from $200 to $5,000. The total was about $30,000 that nobody had been repaid. Each person had a different story from Kyle about why he needed money. Temporary cash flow problems. An investment opportunity that required quick action. Medical bills for a health scare he had never told our parents about. Car repairs after an accident. Every story was designed to create urgency and sympathy while avoiding verification or follow-up. Uncle Robert documented everything in a spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and the stories Kyle had told each person. We brought all of that information to Detective Moore at her office downtown. She spread the documents across her desk and studied them for a long time without saying anything. Finally, she looked up and said, "This established a clear pattern of financial manipulation that strengthened the case against Kyle significantly." She explained that one of the challenges with the grandma situation was that Kyle's attorney could argue it was an isolated incident caused by gambling addiction spiraling out of control. But this pattern going back years showed deliberate, repeated, deceptive behavior for personal gain. It demonstrated that Kyle knew how to manipulate people. He knew how to create convincing stories. He knew how to avoid getting caught. The addiction defense became much weaker when you could show the person was running calculated scams while supposedly being controlled by his disease. Detective Moore said she was building a file that would make it very difficult for Kyle to claim he did not understand what he was doing or could not control his actions. Somehow, my parents found out about Uncle Robert interviewing relatives. I am still not sure who told them. But suddenly, we received an email sent to the entire extended family from Dad's account. The subject line was family unity and false accusations. The email accused me, Ella, and Uncle Robert of conducting a witch hunt against Kyle and trying to destroy the family. It said we were harassing vulnerable family members and manipulating them into making statements against Kyle during his time of greatest need. It claimed we refused to acknowledge that addiction is a disease requiring treatment, not punishment. It said our actions were driven by jealousy and vindictiveness rather than genuine concern. The email ended with a plea for everyone to remember the importance of family loyalty and resist efforts to tear the family apart over money and misunderstandings. I read it 3 times in complete disbelief. They were actually positioning themselves as the victims. They were making Kyle the one being persecuted. Several relatives replied to the group email with messages supporting my parents and saying they would pray for family healing. A few others replied privately to me, saying they stood with us and knew the truth about what Kyle had done. The family was splitting into clear sides, and the division was getting worse every day. 3 weeks after the first confrontation at the family meeting, Mom sent another group email announcing that Kyle had checked himself into a 30-day gambling addiction treatment program at a facility 2 hours away. She framed it as proof that Kyle was taking responsibility and getting the help he needed. The email strongly suggested that now that Kyle was in treatment, the legal action should be dropped so he could focus on recovery without the stress of lawsuits hanging over his head. She included a link to an article about how family support is crucial for addiction recovery and how punitive approaches often lead to relapse. I forwarded the email to Mr. Harrison and asked if Kyle entering treatment changed anything about our civil case. He called me back within an hour and explained that entering treatment did not erase civil liability for breach of fiduciary duty. He said Kyle's attorney might bring it up to gain sympathy, but it had no legal bearing on whether Kyle owed restitution for the money he stole. Mr. Harrison said he was ready to file the lawsuit and that we should not wait any longer. We had given Kyle and my parents plenty of time to make things right voluntarily. They had chosen to attack us instead. He filed the lawsuit that same week. It sought recovery of the stolen funds, plus interest and legal fees, totaling about $230,000. The lawsuit named Kyle as the defendant and detailed the breach of fiduciary duty, the transfers to gambling sites, and the financial harm to Grandma's estate and the intended beneficiaries. Kyle's attorney, Richard Crane, responded with a motion 2 weeks later. He claimed Kyle had no assets to recover and that pursuing the lawsuit would only prevent him from focusing on addiction recovery. The motion included financial statements showing Kyle was completely broke, with significant debts of his own. It argued the lawsuit was punitive rather than restorative and would cause psychological harm that could trigger relapse. The motion requested that the case be dismissed, or at minimum stayed until Kyle completed treatment and had time to establish stable recovery. What happened next made my blood boil. My parents announced they would pay Kyle's legal fees to fight the lawsuit. These were the same parents who told me they could not help with my student loans because they needed to be smart with money. The same parents who told me maybe next year when I asked for $1,000 for a professional certification. Suddenly, they had money available to pay a criminal defense attorney to help Kyle avoid consequences for stealing $200,000 from Grandma. The hypocrisy was so extreme I could barely process it. Mr. Harrison said this was actually helpful information because it showed my parents had resources they had been claiming not to have. It also demonstrated their ongoing pattern of enabling Kyle by protecting him from consequences. He said, "We would respond to the motion and push forward with the case, regardless of their financial support for Kyle's defense." The discovery process started 2 weeks later. Mr. Harrison sent formal requests for Kyle's financial records, employment history, bank statements from the past 3 years, and documentation of any assets he owned. Richard Crane responded with boxes of disorganized papers that we had to sort through page by page. I spent 3 evenings at Mr. Harrison's office going through Kyle's bank statements and credit card bills, highlighting every transfer and cash withdrawal. We found receipts for restaurants I knew Kyle could not afford on his call center salary, payments to online gambling sites under different names, and cash advances from multiple credit cards that were never paid back. Mr. Harrison scheduled Kyle's deposition for 6 weeks later and requested that he bring documentation of his current employment, living situation, and any money he had received from family members in the past year. That was when we found the transfer to Brittany's account. It showed up on a bank statement from 3 months before Grandma died. $40,000 had moved from one of Kyle's accounts to an account in Brittany's name. The memo line said, "Payment for business consulting services." I called Brittany immediately and asked if she knew anything about $40,000 Kyle had given her the previous year. She went quiet for a long moment, then she asked what I was talking about. I explained what we had found in the discovery documents. Brittany said Kyle had told her the money came from his business profits and that he needed to park it in her account temporarily for tax reasons. She thought it was legitimate business income. She had already spent about $15,000 of it on car repairs and helping her mom with medical bills. I told her the money came from Grandma's accounts. Brittany started crying on the phone. She said she had no idea and that she would return every penny she had left. Mr. Harrison said Brittany was not legally responsible because she had received the money in good faith without knowing its source. But her willingness to return it showed Kyle had been lying to everyone about where Grandma's money went. Brittany transferred the remaining $25,000 back within 2 days. She also provided a written statement explaining how Kyle had deceived her about the source of the funds. 3 days after that conversation, my phone started blowing up with text messages from Kyle. The first one said he was sorry for everything. He said he knew he had messed up badly and just wanted a chance to make things right. The second message came 20 minutes later. It said I was destroying his life and making it impossible for him to focus on recovery. The third message said that if I really cared about family, I would drop the lawsuit and give him space to heal. Over the next week, I got maybe 30 messages from him. They alternated between apologies and blame. Kyle said I was being vindictive and cruel. He said I was choosing money over my own brother. He said Mom cried every day because of what I was doing to him. He said the lawsuit was preventing him from moving forward with his life. He said I would regret it when he relapsed, and it was my fault. I did not respond to a single message. I took screenshots of every single one and backed them up in 3 different places. Mr. Harrison said they were perfect evidence of Kyle's continued manipulation tactics and lack of genuine remorse for stealing from Grandma. He said the pattern of alternating apology and blame was textbook manipulator behavior and would be useful if we ended up in front of a judge. The messages kept coming for another week before they finally stopped. Then Mom called me on a Tuesday night. I could hear her crying before she even said hello. She begged me to drop the lawsuit because it was killing her to watch the family fall apart. She said Kyle had learned his lesson. He was getting help. Continuing legal action was just revenge, not justice. I let her talk for maybe 5 minutes before I interrupted and asked her a direct question. I said, Kyle stole $200,000 from your dying mother-in-law and let Grandma live in terrible conditions while he gambled the money away. Do you think that deserves consequences, or should Kyle just get therapy and move on with his life? Mom got quiet for a moment. Then she admitted that what Kyle did was wrong, but then she said he was sick, and punishing him would not bring Grandma back or recover the money. She said I was choosing money over family and that I would regret destroying these relationships when it was too late to fix them. I realized during that conversation that my mom was never going to hold Kyle truly accountable for what he did. Maintaining a relationship with my parents meant accepting their version of reality, where Kyle was a victim of disease instead of someone who made deliberate choices to steal from a dying woman. I told Mom I needed space to think about what kind of relationship we could have going forward. She started crying harder and said I was abandoning the family, just like I had abandoned Kyle. I ended the call and sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. 2 days later, I received a formal email from Dad. The subject line was, Family Decisions and Consequences. He wrote that if I continued with the lawsuit against Kyle, they would consider me to have chosen to remove myself from the family. The email listed all the ways they had supported me over the years. The tuition help for my first year of college before I got scholarships. The car they had co-signed for when I was 22. The times they had let me stay with them between apartments. Dad said this was how I repaid their love and sacrifice, by attacking my brother when he was at his lowest point and needed family support most. He said I had 1 week to decide whether I wanted to be part of the family or continue down a path of bitterness and revenge. I forwarded the email to Mr. Harrison without comment. He called me within an hour and said it was more evidence of the family pattern that had enabled Kyle's behavior for years. That weekend, Uncle Robert called and said he had been talking with Aunt Linda and Ella about everything that had happened. He said they wanted to form a support group for those of us dealing with the aftermath of Kyle's theft and my parents' enabling behavior. We started meeting every Thursday night at Uncle Robert's house. At first, it was just the 4 of us. We talked about the unbelievable things my parents said to defend Kyle and reminded each other that we were not wrong for expecting consequences. Ella brought her notes from years of watching Kyle manipulate different family members, and we started documenting patterns we had all observed but never connected before. Aunt Linda made coffee and listened while we vented about the latest guilt trips from my parents. Uncle Robert shared stories from cases he had worked where family members enabled destructive behavior until it was too late. He talked about how important it was to maintain boundaries, even when it felt cruel. Those Thursday meetings became the only place I felt sane during those weeks of legal proceedings and family pressure. 5 weeks after filing the lawsuit, Kyle's financial disclosure documents arrived in a thick manila envelope. Mr. Harrison walked me through them page by page in his office. Kyle had no assets at all, no savings account, no retirement fund, no property, nothing of value except a 7-year-old car with a broken transmission sitting in my parents' driveway. He owed about $70,000 to various online gambling sites and personal loan companies, plus another $8,000 on maxed-out credit cards. His employment history showed he had been working part-time at a call center for the previous 4 months, making minimum wage and averaging maybe 20 hours a week. Before that, he had been unemployed for 6 months, living with our parents and supposedly looking for work. The disclosure listed every debt, every failed payment plan, every account sent to collections. Mr. Harrison spread the papers across his desk and explained that even winning the lawsuit would not mean we would actually recover money. We could get a judgment against Kyle that would follow him for years, maybe decades, depending on state law. We could garnish his wages if he ever got a real job. But the reality was that collecting from someone with negative net worth was basically impossible. He showed me the math. Wage garnishment would usually take maybe 10 or 15% of someone's paycheck after taxes and mandatory deductions. Kyle's part-time minimum wage job would yield maybe $30 or $40 per month at most. At that rate, it would take more than 400 years to recover the $200,000. Mr. Harrison said we could pursue the judgment anyway because it would legally establish what Kyle had done and create consequences that affected his credit and financial future. But he said I needed to understand that actual money recovery was not going to happen anytime soon. I sat in that office staring at Kyle's financial disclosure, trying to decide whether continuing the lawsuit made any sense. The whole point had been to hold Kyle accountable and recover at least some of Grandma's money for the family. But if there was nothing to recover, what was the point of spending more money on legal fees? I called Uncle Robert from my car in the parking lot and explained the situation, reading him some of the numbers from the disclosure. He was quiet for a minute. Then he said it was not really about the money anymore. It was about making sure Kyle faced legal consequences for what he had done, instead of skating by with therapy and sympathy like always. Ella said the same thing when I talked to her that evening. She said if we dropped the lawsuit now, Kyle would once again learn that he could do terrible things and face no real consequences. We met at Uncle Robert's house the next Thursday and talked through all the options. The three of us sat around his kitchen table with coffee and the financial disclosure papers spread out between us. Uncle Robert said that in his years as a cop, he had seen too many cases where family members let things slide because pursuing justice seemed too hard or too expensive. Then the person just kept doing worse things because they knew they could get away with it. Ella pointed out that we had already spent money on the retainer and filed the lawsuit. Stopping now would mean Kyle won simply by being broke and pathetic. I realized they were both right. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about recovering money. It had become about establishing that actions have consequences, even inside families. 2 days later, Mom called me and said she had something important to tell me. She said she had been working with her therapist and had what she described as a breakthrough. Her voice sounded different, less defensive, more tired, like she had been crying recently. She said she was starting to recognize how her favoritism toward Kyle had damaged both of her sons over the years. She said she had held me to impossible standards while letting Kyle get away with everything because she was afraid of losing his love. She apologized for all the double standards, for dismissing my accomplishments while celebrating Kyle's failures as learning experiences, for making me pay for the scraped garage door while buying Kyle a new truck after drunk driving. She went through specific examples from our childhood and teenage years, acknowledging things I had pointed out dozens of times, things she had always denied or minimized before. For a moment, the apology felt genuine in a way I had never heard from her. It sounded like she was actually seeing the pattern instead of just defending herself. She cried while talking about how she had enabled Kyle's behavior for so long that she had helped create the person who could steal from his dying grandmother. She said she needed to take responsibility for her part in that. Then she said she hoped that now that she was acknowledging all of this, I would consider dropping the lawsuit and letting the family move forward together. She said she understood why I was angry and hurt. She accepted that she had caused a lot of that pain, but continuing to pursue legal action against Kyle, she said, would only create more damage and prevent healing. She wanted us to focus on being a family again. She wanted us to support Kyle's recovery while building a healthier dynamic where both her sons felt valued and loved. And just like that, the apology that had felt so genuine suddenly felt incomplete. She was acknowledging past mistakes, but she still did not accept that current consequences were appropriate. She was admitting she had been wrong for years, but she still wanted me to protect Kyle from the results of his choices. That was exactly the same pattern that had created the entire situation. I told Mom I appreciated her recognizing the favoritism and double standards. I told her it meant something to hear her finally admit those things out loud instead of denying them. But I explained that I needed to see sustained changed behavior over time, not just words and promises during one phone call. I said, dropping the lawsuit now would repeat the exact pattern of protecting Kyle from consequences that had enabled his behavior his entire life. She started crying harder. She said I was being cruel and unforgiving. She said she was trying to make things right and I was throwing it back in her face. I stayed calm and repeated that changed behavior over time was what mattered, not apologies that came with conditions attached. She said she did not know how to fix this if I would not even give her a chance. I told her that letting the lawsuit proceed was part of giving everyone a chance to build something healthier. We ended the call without resolving anything. I felt exhausted and sad, but also clear that I had made the right choice. 6 weeks after the initial confrontation, Kyle completed his 30-day gambling treatment program at the facility my parents had found and paid for. They threw him a celebration dinner for taking control of his recovery. They invited the whole extended family to recognize his achievement and support his journey. The invitation came through a group text from Mom with details about the restaurant and time. She wrote about how proud they were of Kyle for doing the hard work of facing his addiction. I did not respond to the group text, but Mom called me directly 2 days before the dinner and asked if I was coming. She said it would mean so much to Kyle to have his brother there supporting him. I told her I was not going to celebrate Kyle completing basic treatment he should have done years earlier, especially when he was only in treatment because he had been caught stealing $200,000. She said I was being petty and holding grudges instead of supporting family. She said Kyle was making real changes and deserved recognition for his effort. I said no thanks and ended the call. Almost immediately, I received texts from Dad saying I was disappointing them again and choosing bitterness over family unity. The civil lawsuit moved forward to mediation about a week after Kyle's celebration dinner, the one I did not attend. Mr. Harrison called me the morning of mediation to go over what to expect. He explained that Kyle's attorney had indicated they wanted to propose a settlement instead of going to trial. The mediation happened in a conference room at a legal office downtown. Mr. Harrison and I sat on one side of a long table. Kyle's attorney sat on the other. Kyle was not even there. His attorney explained that this was standard for mediation because having the parties in the same room often made negotiations harder. The settlement proposal was straightforward. Kyle would sign documents admitting that he breached his fiduciary duty to Grandma and misappropriated her funds for personal use. He would agree to a payment plan of $200 per month for 10 years, with the payments going into an account that would be distributed to Grandma's intended heirs. He would also commit to continuing gambling addiction treatment, with proof provided every 3 months. If he missed payments or stopped treatment, the entire remaining balance would become immediately due. Kyle's attorney presented this as a reasonable resolution that acknowledged wrongdoing while being realistic about Kyle's ability to pay. He emphasized that going to trial would cost everyone more money, with probably worse outcomes. Mr. Harrison asked for a break to discuss the offer privately. We moved to a smaller conference room down the hall. He pulled out his calculator and showed me the math. $200 per month for 10 years equals $24,000 total. That was roughly 12% of what Kyle actually stole from Grandma. Mr. Harrison said that from a pure financial recovery standpoint, this was probably more than we would get through wage garnishment over the same time period, given Kyle's employment situation. The real value of the settlement was getting Kyle's admission of wrongdoing on legal record. That admission could never be erased. It would follow him permanently. Mr. Harrison recommended accepting the settlement because it achieved the main goal of establishing consequences and legal accountability, even though the financial recovery was minimal. He also pointed out that going to trial would cost another $10,000 in legal fees, with no guarantee of a better outcome. He said judges often looked favorably on defendants who admitted wrongdoing and proposed reasonable payment plans. I called Uncle Robert from the conference room and explained the settlement terms. I read him the exact language about admitting wrongdoing and the payment structure. He put me on speaker so Ella could hear too. We talked through whether accepting such a small amount was basically letting Kyle off easy. Ella said $24,000 was insulting compared to $200,000. But Uncle Robert pointed out that we had already established Kyle had nothing to take. This was about getting the admission on record more than the money. I asked what they honestly thought we should do. After a long pause, Uncle Robert said we should accept it. He explained that the legal admission of breaching fiduciary duty would be part of Kyle's permanent record. It would affect his ability to ever have power of attorney or manage anyone else's finances. It would establish in official legal documents that he stole from his dying grandmother. Ella agreed that having that on record was worth more than fighting for years over money we would probably never collect anyway. Together, we recognized that this was about establishing consequences and documenting Kyle's admission in a way that could not be denied or minimized. Full financial recovery was never realistic, given his situation. We went back to Mr. Harrison's office the next week for the actual signing. Kyle showed up with his attorney and my parents. My parents looked like they were attending a funeral instead of watching their son admit to stealing from his dying grandmother. The conference room felt smaller this time, with just the 6 of us around the table. Mr. Harrison laid out the settlement documents in front of Kyle and walked through each section out loud. He said, "This paragraph states that you, Kyle Young, acknowledge and admit that you breached your fiduciary duty as power of attorney to Dorothy Young." Then he continued, "This section states that you misappropriated approximately $200,000 from her accounts for personal use, specifically online gambling, between January and June of this year." Kyle's hand shook when he picked up the pen. My mom reached over and squeezed his shoulder, but he pulled away and signed each page where his attorney pointed. The admission was now part of his permanent legal record. It could never be erased or explained away. Mr. Harrison collected the signed documents and made copies for everyone. Kyle stared at the table. My parents glared at me like I had personally destroyed their son's life, instead of holding him accountable for destroying Grandma's. My parents called me 3 days after the signing. Dad did most of the talking, while Mom cried in the background. They wanted to discuss the payment terms. Dad said $200 per month was going to prevent Kyle from getting back on his feet financially. He asked if maybe we could reduce it to $100 or let them make the payments for him. I reminded Dad that the settlement specifically stated Kyle had to make the payments himself and that third-party payments would void the agreement. He went quiet for a minute. Then he said I was being unnecessarily rigid and punitive when Kyle was already struggling with gambling addiction and trying to rebuild his life. I told him Kyle had gambled away $200,000 while Grandma froze in her house and ate generic bread, and that paying $24,000 over 10 years was getting off incredibly easy. Mom grabbed the phone. Through tears, she said I was choosing money over family and that she did not raise me to be so cold and unforgiving. I hung up when she started asking why I could not just let it go and move forward. 2 months after everything exploded, I sat down and wrote clear boundaries for my relationship with my parents. I would attend Thanksgiving and Christmas because those were major holidays involving the whole extended family. I would not come to smaller gatherings where Kyle was the center of attention or being celebrated for basic adult responsibilities like keeping a job or staying away from gambling. I would not discuss Kyle, the lawsuit, or the settlement with them at all because every conversation turned into them defending him and attacking me. I sent the boundaries in an email, so there would be written documentation, and so they could not interrupt or argue while I was explaining. Mom called within an hour. She spent 20 minutes trying to convince me to be more flexible. She said families are supposed to forgive and move past difficulties together. She said my rigid boundaries were just another way of punishing Kyle and them. I repeated that these were my terms for maintaining any relationship at all and that I was not negotiating. She said I would regret this someday when it was too late to fix things. Then she hung up crying. The boundaries held, but Mom tested them constantly. She would call every few days with some new angle about why I should be more forgiving or flexible. Kyle was doing so well in recovery, and it would mean so much to him if I came to his birthday dinner. Kyle got a promotion at work, and they were having a small celebration, and couldn't I just stop by for an hour? She sent text messages with photos of family gatherings I had declined to attend, with captions about how sad it was that I was missing these precious moments. Dad mostly respected the boundaries in practice, but he made passive-aggressive comments whenever we did see each other. At Thanksgiving, he mentioned 3 different times how nice it was when the whole family could be together without drama and division. When I helped clear dishes after Christmas dinner, he said something about how family loyalty and forgiveness used to mean something in this family. I did not take the bait either time. I changed the subject or walked away. Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda became my primary family connection almost immediately. We started having dinner every Tuesday night at their house. They called to check in on weekends. Aunt Linda texted me funny memes and articles she thought I would like during the week. Uncle Robert made a point of inviting me to things he knew my parents would not attend, like baseball games or hiking trips. They also set boundaries with my parents around Kyle topics and refused to engage when Mom or Dad tried to complain about my rigidity or convince them to talk sense into me. Aunt Linda told me, Mom called her crying one night and asked her to explain to me that families are supposed to stick together no matter what. Linda told Mom that sticking together does not mean protecting people from consequences. She said maybe if my parents had held Kyle accountable years earlier, Grandma would still have her savings. Apparently, Mom hung up on her too. The other relatives who had supported accountability at the family meeting also stayed in closer contact with me. We formed this unofficial coalition of people who refused to pretend everything was fine. Ella and I got much closer through everything that happened. We started meeting for dinner once a month at a Thai place halfway between our apartments. We spent hours talking about family patterns and supporting each other in maintaining boundaries. She told me about growing up watching Kyle get away with everything and feeling crazy because nobody else seemed to notice or care. I told her about the years of double standards and feeling like nothing I did was ever good enough. We realized we had both been gaslit by my parents for decades into thinking we were the problems. Ella started dating a guy named Daniel who worked in her building. She actually introduced him to me before telling my parents, which felt significant. She said she wanted people she trusted to meet him first, instead of letting my parents form opinions and create drama. We took Daniel to the Thai place, and he was genuinely nice. He seemed good for her. When Ella finally told my parents about Daniel a month later, Mom immediately asked when they were getting engaged and whether Ella had thought about what kind of wedding she wanted. Ella shut that down fast. She said they had been dating 8 weeks and Mom needed to calm down. 3 months after the initial confrontation, I started seeing a therapist to work through the complicated feelings about my family. I had been carrying so much anger, hurt, and confusion about why my parents chose Kyle over truth and accountability. My therapist helped me understand that I was grieving more than the grandma situation. I was grieving the fantasy of having parents who would choose what was right over what was comfortable. She pointed out that I kept hoping they would suddenly wake up and recognize how badly they had failed both of their sons by enabling Kyle and holding me to impossible standards. We worked on accepting my parents as they actually were, instead of who I wished they would be. She said I could love them while also accepting that our relationship would never be what I had hoped for. Both things could be true at the same time. It helped to have someone validate that my feelings were reasonable. Setting boundaries was not cruel or punitive. It was healthy and necessary. Mr. Harrison sent me confirmation that Kyle made his first payment on time. $200 deposited into the account we had set up for tracking the settlement. The second payment came through on time too. Exactly 30 days later. I had no idea whether Kyle was actually working on his gambling addiction or just going through the motions to satisfy the settlement terms. Mr. Harrison said the treatment program verification forms came through quarterly, and the first one showed Kyle attending group meetings twice a week. But I had accepted that it was not my responsibility to monitor Kyle's recovery or care whether he was genuinely changing. My responsibility was to myself, and to honoring Grandma's memory by making sure Kyle faced some kind of consequence, even if those consequences were minimal compared to what he had actually done. The hardest part of everything was not the money Grandma lost. It was not even Kyle's theft. The hardest part was grieving the fantasy of having parents who would choose what was right over what was comfortable. I had spent my whole life trying to earn their approval and recognition by being responsible, successful, and careful. By doing everything right, Kyle had spent his whole life getting their unconditional support and protection no matter what he did wrong. When the moment came that should have finally made them see the pattern, they doubled down on protecting him instead. That realization hurt worse than any amount of stolen money. It meant accepting that nothing I could ever do would change how they saw us. I was learning to accept them as they were, instead of hoping they would suddenly transform into the parents I needed them to be. Uncle Robert invited me over for coffee one Saturday morning, about a week after Kyle's second payment came through. We sat on his back porch, and he told me Grandma would be proud of how I had stood up for what was right, even when it was hard and lonely. He said Grandma had her own struggles with family members who took advantage of her kindness over the years. Her sister borrowed money constantly and never paid it back. Her brother got her to co-sign a loan he defaulted on. She spent decades being the family doormat because she thought being nice and forgiving was the same as being good. Robert said that toward the end of her life, Grandma told him she wished she had had more backbone earlier. She wished she had stood up to people who used her. She said the people she respected most were the ones who did the right thing, even when it cost them something. Robert squeezed my shoulder and said I had the backbone Grandma wished she had developed sooner. He said she would be grateful someone finally held Kyle accountable, even though it fractured the family. 4 months after the confrontation, I started hosting Thanksgiving at my apartment with Uncle Robert, Aunt Linda, Ella, and a few other relatives who had stood up for what was right. We ordered pizza instead of cooking turkey because nobody wanted to spend hours in the kitchen pretending everything was normal. Ella brought Daniel, her new boyfriend, and she seemed relaxed for the first time in months. Uncle Robert told stories about Grandma that made us laugh instead of cry. We played board games. Nobody mentioned Kyle or my parents or the settlement. It felt strange at first to celebrate a holiday without the whole family, but it also felt freeing because we did not have to walk on eggshells or ignore obvious problems. We decided to make it a regular thing. Once a month, we would get together for dinner or coffee. We were building something new instead of trying to fix something broken. My parents sent a group text on Christmas asking if I would reconsider spending the holidays with them. I replied that I would stop by for an hour on Christmas afternoon, but I would not stay for dinner. To my surprise, they respected that boundary. Mom texted separately and said she understood I needed space and that she was working on herself in therapy. Dad did not say much, but he stopped sending passive-aggressive messages about family loyalty. Kyle made his fourth payment on time, according to the notifications from the settlement account. I had no idea if he was actually staying away from gambling or had just learned to hide it better. Mr. Harrison sent confirmation emails each month showing the deposits, and I filed them away without much emotion. The whole situation taught me that justice inside families does not look like justice in movies. Nobody went to jail. Kyle did not have some big moment of genuine remorse. My parents did not suddenly realize they had been wrong for decades. What I got instead was $200 a month, a few relatives who actually cared about doing the right thing, and the knowledge that I stood up for Grandma, even when it cost me the fantasy of having normal parents. That had to be enough, because it was all I was ever going to get.